Okay, so we are going to talk about structure, but I do want to highlight the fact that this is just a suggested structure. So depending on the company that you have, the industry, the recommendation, your general argument, it may lend itself to a different structure that you think is better and results in a stronger argument. That's fine. You may want to tweak the structure or change it because you have some additional areas that you want to cover. That's absolutely fine as well. Consider this to be a starting point rather than a structure that you have to follow. It's just something to start your planning process on. Right, so starting with the first couple of things are just the same as any other business report, really. So you'll have your title page. You really should have at least 3 bits of information on there. That's your student number, the unit code, which is BSS071-3, and the assessment number. So this is assessment 2. Your executive summary should be a summary and not just a trailer for your work. So you should have ideally a short paragraph explaining what the premise or the purpose of the report is, and then another short paragraph highlighting what the key findings of the report are. So please don't write things like, this report will give a recommendation for a new market to enter and an entry mode to use. That's not really helpful. You really do need to tell me in the executive summary, because it's supposed to be a summary of your report, what the major findings are. So, i.e., what is the new national market to enter? What is the entry mode to use? That should be 2 short paragraphs or half a page maximum, whichever is shorter. That's the general convention. And then you have your table of contents. Now, I should go without saying that if you're going to have a table of contents, you really need to have page numbers. So please do read through the academic guide if you just want a refresher on how a business report should look. Those are excluded from your word count. So your word count doesn't start being counted until you hit your introduction. So in the introduction, you simply cover an explanation of what the fundamental purpose of the report is. So you introduce the premise of the report. You have any background or contextual information that is needed in order to understand the rest of the report. So anything which you think is necessary, and that can include things like any acronyms which are going to be used repeatedly, or anything else really that you think is necessary to have a good contextual understanding of what the report is discussing. And then lastly, you need to give an overview of how the rest of the report is structured. So section A will cover this, section B will cover that, so on and so on. And then moving on to the main body, I would suggest that the first thing that you want to do is really to evaluate what the current organizational international strategy and what the current state of affairs with the company's global operations are. So your recommendation should make sense in the context of how your company or your organization is currently operating. So you'll want to put a lot of high quality non-academic citation presumably in there. You'll want to discuss the international strategy that's being used. So in order for the reader to understand your recommendations in the context of what the current state of play for the organization or the company is. Then moving on to section B, discussing the country selection method. So you'd want to, if you're using scanning, you'll want to include your scanning table here, discussion of what scanning is, and then obviously your output of your scanning table, i.e. the actual new country, the new national market that you're proposing. If you're using Uppsala, then a discussion of Uppsala, a map usually of the current areas of operation. That would be the ideal thing to include. So you're putting the actual proposed national market front and center. So sections C, D, and E are going to be arguments for why this is the best national market to enter for your company, your organization. So you're using section B to put it up front and center. So you're not going to hold it back to be revealed as a secret later on, but you're actually going to place that in section B, and then you spend C, D, and E justifying your choice of new national market to enter. I would suggest that you use section C to look through the macro environmental trends. So this can be political factors, social factors, economic factors, as well as legal factors, and indeed cultural factors as well. So the exact mix of factors will be dependent on your argument and what's most important for your argument. Remember that if, for example, you're recommending a market to enter and they are major risk factors, you don't want to just pretend that they don't exist. So even if something appears to weaken your argument, or at least weaken your case, and the way to deal with this and still have a strong argument is to acknowledge it, discuss it, and explain why it doesn't invalidate that national market as a good investment. So don't ignore things that weaken your case. You can still construct a very strong argument if you tackle them head on. I would suggest section D then moves on from, instead of just the macro environmental trends, to actually talk about some of the more practical and operational factors, including the trade barriers, economic integration, supply chain issues. So again, the exact mix will depend on what you think is most important for your particular argument. Section E, I suggest, highlights possible ethical issues. So again, this is going to be a relatively small part of your assessment, maybe more important for some companies than others, but highlighting possible ethical issues will make your report stronger overall. Once you've done sections A, B, C, D, and E, then I think you've kind of justified the national market. Then you can move on to discuss and justify the use of a particular entry mode. Now, this makes most sense for something like scanning. If you're going to use Uppsala or indeed OLI, then you may want to move section F to incorporate the discussion of entry modes into the country selection method. And that's because for both Uppsala and for OLI, the two things very much work hand in hand. Your national market to enter is very much something you choose alongside the entry mode. The two influence each other. Otherwise, you could have that as a separate section at the end where you move the focus to micro environmental factors, discussion of the competitive marketplace and so on, competitive rivalries within the marketplace, and have a strong justification for your entry mode. Then you'd have your conclusion. So no new information in the conclusion as ever. You're just summarizing what the key points of your argument are and summarizing it in a concise manner to restate your argument. Then you'd have your reference list, which ideally would be quite comprehensive, after you've fully tackled the assessment task. And then if you have used any appendices, then you would place them after the reference list. But remember that the title page, exec summary, table of contents, none of these things are included in the word count, but rather it's the others that would be. I probably should have been flicking forward the slides when discussing them one by one. So your word count itself is restricted to just this. So introduction, your main body sections, and your conclusion. Everything else would be excluded from the word count.